We'll fill in some information about each one of them, and we'll talk about some examples. Now, I know you guys are familiar with plant and animal kingdom, definitely. Probably fungi a little bit. But after that, probably some of these kingdoms you have very little knowledge of. But animals, of course, we all know about. So let me ask you this question. What makes something an animal and not a plant or a fungus or a protist or something else? What could you think of that might determine something as an animal? Joe?
They have animal cells.
Okay, yeah, I mean their cells are unique, sort of. Christian?
They're living and
They're what?
living and
Well, all of these things are living. You know, even a plant or a fungus or a bacteria, they're all living.
they move.
They don't all move though. Like for example, a sponge is an animal. It doesn't really move though. Shay?
Their genes and where they came from, like their parents.
Yeah, but like what characteristics would we look for in something? If I show you this living organism, how would you know it belongs in the animal kingdom?
They have.
Jackson?
Some animals, like they have organs.
I want to know all animals.
All animals have organs.
They don't all have organs.
No, not as far.
Maggie?
Because it can move.
Not all animals can actually move.
They can do.
Well, they do, but that would be true of everything.
Oh.
All right. So it's not easy to come up with these, but that's what we'll be talking about today. So animals, first off, animal is the largest kingdom that we identified species from. So it's the largest kingdom. When we think about all the identified species on Earth, almost 3/4 are from the animal kingdom. Now, it's not necessarily because 3/4 of the species on Earth are actually animals, but animals are easy to identify. They're large, they're things we relate to, so they can be found fairly easily, and that may be part of the reason why many of the identified species are animals.
They're large if you want them to be large. Aren't large. Ants aren't large.
But larger than bacteria and protists.
I'm not large.
All right, so let's think about what we talked about yesterday. So yesterday we talked about 3 main categories that we look at when we're putting things into kingdoms. Number of cells, how they get energy, and whether they're prokaryotes or eukaryotes. So let's talk about cells first. What word would we use to describe animals? We used 2 words yesterday. We defined them. So animals are what? Number of cells. Jared?
Multicellular.
Yes, they are multicellular. So they are made of many cells working together. Animals are multicellular. How about from our question today, what about the nucleus? Think back when you drew and when we looked at animal cells. What word would you use to describe the animal cell? We used 2 words in our question today, Shay? They're eukaryotes. They do have a nucleus in their cells. They have complex cells with organelles. The third factor has to do with energy. We use 2 words for this as well. 2 words about how living things obtain energy. Maggie?
Photosynthesis is how the plants do it.
Yep.
And then the animals have to hunt for it.
Yeah, and we use a specific term for animals or for organisms that need to go out and find or hunt food. It started with an H. You remember what it is?
Hydrocopia.
No, Jared?
Heterotroph.
Heterotroph is the word. And that just means they have to eat or consume other organisms to get energy.
That's one word. So what?
So those are the characteristics of any animal that you could think of is multicellular, is eukaryotic, and is a
I
heterotroph.
know.
Even if it's a sponge or a person or
What do sponges eat?
they filter tiny little particles of food out of the seawater.
I know that's kind of gross.
All right, so examples, there's lots of them. Spider,
Wolfen.
penguin,
Wolfen.
cat,
Wolfen eats sponges.
all of those are examples of animals.
What about the dog? Where's the wolfen?
What about the Zorus?
I'm
All right. So that's the animal kingdom, and that's one that should be pretty easy. Well, let's talk about plants, and let's go through sort of the same thing. So thinking about, you obviously know about plants. How about, what word would we use in terms of the number of cells? What's the proper word we'll use for plants? Awesome. Is a tree, is that white birch tree out there made of a single cell?
No.
Multicellular. They are multicellular. How about in terms of nucleus? Think back to when we looked at those plant cells. We looked at the onion cell, you looked at Elodia. What word should we use, Abby? They are also eukaryotes. They do have a nucleus in their cell. They have complex organelles. What term would we use for their nutrition? Brandon? They go through photosynthesis, but we use the other word. Yeah. Look that way. I'm looking for some other individuals to.
I know this one. You never told me.
Yeah, autotroph. Good. They are autotrophs. Auto sort of means self. Autotroph means self-food. They make food themselves.
Like the second largest animal?
Yeah.
You still owe me for not talking that whole
All right. So
time.
examples: plants are trees, corn plant, grass. Those are all examples of plants.
Excuse me, we just need to do something and I'll leave, okay?
No problem.
Thank you.
All right. So those are the two kingdoms that we're probably very familiar with. Now the next three, though, the next four, I should say, you probably don't know quite as well. Now fungi, maybe a little bit.
I love fungi.
Yeah.
Fungi.
I've been called that before.
Fungi. Take it back a notch, Mr. Dura.
A fungus. Now when I say fungus, you're probably thinking of just one thing.
Mushrooms.
Mushrooms. But there are other types of fungi as well.
Tree moss. That's
Yeah.
green stuff. That's
Molds, yeast, all other types of fungus.
One of those boats I found it.
So what are the characteristics? So first off, let's think about, again, cells
Cells.
for fungus. Abby? Excuse me? Well, this is a little bit tricky because yes, but there are some unicellular fungi as well. Things like yeast are unicellular, but a mushroom is multicellular.
I know there's a fruit that's made of fungus.
Called mushrooms.
No, called blue cheese.
Yeah, it has to be a fungus, or it has a type of mold.
It's really good.
Yeah.
All cheese is made of fungus.
Not all cheese.
Well, most.
Yeah, mold, some blue, so we call those blue cheeses. Things like blue cheese or, no, not cream cheese. But the blue part is created by a fungus.
Yellow.
All right, also,
It's delicious.
fungi have a nucleus.
That's so gross.
So what's the word that we should use? Somebody else that hasn't raised their hand, please.
But I already raised my hand and you never called me.
Patrick.
Prokaryote?
No, they do have a nucleus. Olivia? Eukaryote. They are eukaryotes.
Why is it in
Now the
parentheses?
next one is interesting in nutrition. A lot of people, they see a mushroom and they sort of think it must be some kind of,
Eat it. Vegetable.
some kind of plant. But it's not, even though they sort of grow out of the ground, they don't move, but they're not plants. And that has to do with this third area here. So how do they get nutrition? Maggie?
Like, they're the roots, like, from the ground?
They
instead
have
of from, like, dead,
roots.
like,
From what?
from dead stuff?
Yeah, mushrooms, for example, are something called a decomposer.
Smile on her face.
They can
Dead
release,
animals on the
they
ground,
release
like,
enzymes that break down different material, and then they absorb that material, and that's what they use for their energy. So if you think about, if you're walking through the forest and you see like a log, a rotted log that fell over, there may be a whole bunch of mushrooms growing out of it. That's because they're breaking it down and absorbing the nutrients from that wood that's decaying. Or in my front yard, for example, near the road, we used to have a tree there, but it died, so we had it cut down and the stump ground out. But every spring, in that same, right where the tree was, every spring there's a huge patch of mushrooms that starts to grow early in the spring. So why do they grow there each year?
The soil.
Abby?
Yeah, they're still using the.
Yeah, there's still, parts of the roots are still underground, and the mushrooms that grow there, they're using that as their source of energy. They're breaking it down little by little, year after year, and absorbing those nutrients, and that's what they use for energy.
What happens when they
Mushrooms are decomposers. Then there's no more food there, and they have to,
move?
they're not going to grow there anymore.
Do they seriously, like...
They don't get up and move. Mushrooms and other fungi, they spread through spores. So,
Ew.
for example, when you, if you are trying to identify a mushroom, one thing that you might do is called a spore print, where you take the cap of the mushroom, you put it on like a piece of white, plain white paper, and you leave it overnight. When you pick it up the next morning, what you can see is an imprint. You know, mushrooms have gills, those sort of lines.
I like
They
to read
release
on the
spores,
Bible.
these little reproductive cells. And when you take it off the paper, you can see the color of those spores, and that's one way people use to identify mushrooms. But those are the reproductive cells. When the mushroom cap releases those spores, they sort of float away, and when they land somewhere, like a seed, they can start to grow in that new area.
That's cool.
But anyway, hold on.
Why do people eat mushrooms?
So they do have a cell wall as well. That's another important factor. Mushrooms and other fungi, they have a cell wall, and they're heterotrophs. They break down organic material, and that's their source of energy. So they don't need sunlight. Mushrooms can grow in the dark because they're breaking down material, and that's their food. Jackson?
Some mushrooms, like at my dad's house, they get to be like the size of like a baseball
Yeah,
and bigger.
and bigger. Like puffball, you probably found little puffballs. Those are actually edible.
I hit my
They're edible when they're young. Those puffballs, before they get all dried up and you could squeeze it and know what's coming out? Spores. Those are spores.
Ew.
So when you squeeze those are those spores of that puffball mushroom. They're floating around. Eventually they land somewhere. They could start to grow into a new fungus. But if you get those when they're young and they're all sort of white, they are edible. Once they start drying out and releasing spores, they're not edible anymore.
Can I eat
But some
that?
mushrooms are poisonous. Some mushrooms are deadly. Some are edible. And so you have to know very well which ones are edible and which are not, because you can make yourself very sick or die from eating them. All right, Andrew?
One time I took this big mushroom and I did it with my baseball bat and it
Jesus.
slid all over me.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably one of those puffballs. And those puffballs, they can get, this big.
They're huge.
Joe?
I want to jump
All
on.
right, shh, Joe?
Athletes.
Athlete's foot
Ew, stop it.
is caused, and there are several types of infections. Ringworm is another one. You ever see those commercials on TV with the toenail fungus? Or those, all those are caused by a fungus, including athlete's foot, that toenail fungus. Yeah. No, they're fungus. And the medicine you could take is called a fungicide. It's a compound that kills fungus. Maggie?
So, how would they break down dead animals? Like, would they
They release enzymes which break down, just like in your digestive system, enzymes break down foods you eat. They release enzymes in the soil, which break down that dead organic material. Jared?
So they technically decompose themselves.
Excuse me.
I was in the woods I was in like the first one time, and I found this log and it had a bunch of like balls on it. So I poked it with a stick and then released a bunch of like green gas. It was really weird because it was like really like bright green.
Yeah. And those spores can be all different colors. All right. So now mushrooms are not the only type of fungus. Yeast, which you use to bake bread and stuff, is also a type of fungus.
Are you serious? I've never eaten
So
bread.
yeast is, did anyone ever bake bread from scratch and use yeast?
Yeah.
So yeast, if you buy it at the grocery store, it either comes in a little packet or a little container, but it's a powder. It's sort of like a powder. And those are tiny little yeast that are sort of inactive. But when you add them to sort of warm water, then they start to become active and they're alive. And what happens is when you mix those yeast with flour, they start to break down sugars that are in that dough, and they break it down. They're using it for energy, and they are releasing carbon dioxide gas. That carbon dioxide gas that they release forms little bubbles in the dough, and that causes the dough to rise. When you slice bread, and you see those little like air pockets in there, those little blank spots, that's the carbon dioxide that was released by the yeast that was in the dough.
That's so cool.
Also, some other yeast, different types of yeast have different byproducts. Some yeast break down sugars and release alcohol, and that's how yeast is used to make beer or wine. Good. So yeast, mushrooms, also mold.
What the heck?
Mold is another type of fungus, like in a
It's soft.
Jackson. Like in a wet, sort of like in a basement that's wet and damp, you could have mold start to grow. Mold is just another type of fungus. Mildew is a type of fungus.
It's moss.
And they grow in wet, sort of warm, moist areas, or on things like bread. Those are types of fungus.
Why die since it's like fungus?
Screama?
Is that why the thing that held our Christmas tree, when you picked up our Christmas tree, it was all like black?
To get mold, yeah, black mold, yep. Maggie?
Okay, so one time I left this piece of bread out on the table,
Yeah.
and then I came back like a long time later, and it was still on the counter, which I thought was kind of cool that it stayed there that long.
Yeah.
And without being eaten, and there was like this blue stuff coming out of it, and I thought it was blue cheese, and I almost ate it, but then I didn't.
No, that's mold.
I almost ate cheese.
Jackson?
Is moss the same thing as
No, moss is a separate category type of plant. All right.
I love it.
Now this next group, Protists, we probably, we're going to spend about a week and a half looking at and talking about Protists starting probably the middle of next week. So the Protists Kingdom is unicellular. So they're all single-celled organisms. And you find protists usually in the water. If you, go to a pond or a lake, if you took a sample of that water, look at it in a microscope, you'll probably see many different types of protists living in that water. They're single-celled, so generally they're microscopic, but they're living organisms. They're unicellular, they're eukaryotes, so they have a nucleus and they have other organelles inside of them. And sometimes, some types of protists are autotroph, and other types are heterotroph. It depends on what type of protist you're talking about. Some can be autotroph, some can be heterotroph. And we're going to look at them, like I said, next week or the week after. And we're going to look at three. You may have heard of an amoeba before. An amoeba.
My mom's friend's name.
That's one type of protist. We're also going to look at euglena, another one, and paramecium, which is another one. Those are all types of protists.
Amoeba. Amoeba is kind of a creepy name.
Alright, so that's 4 out of 6 kingdoms. The last two are bacteria and Archaea.
Archaea.
So bacteria you are probably familiar with for a couple reasons. First, some types of bacteria are what we call pathogens. They can cause disease and illness, but other types are beneficial and helpful to us as well. So bacteria, what about number of cells?
Unicellular. No, there's cells. Unicellular.
Unicellular.
They're already in cells. So they can't.
They are prokaryotes. They don't have a nucleus. Bacteria are small and pretty simple cells. They don't have a nucleus. They don't have other complex organelles. And some bacteria are heterotrophs and need to eat other things. Some are autotrophs. Just depends on the type of
Some
bacteria.
eat other bacteria.
Some can eat other bacteria or break down other decaying matter like fungi.
Well,
And now when we say examples, I really shouldn't say bacteria as an example of bacteria.
yeah.
There are types of bacteria. You probably have heard of E. coli.
Yeah.
That's one type of bacteria. Salmonella. Strep bacteria is the bacteria that causes strep throat. So those are some types of bacteria.
I never had strep throat.
Good.
Isn't that, aren't there like good bacteria that
Yeah.
get from like yogurt?
And some bacteria are good for us. We have many types of bacteria live in our digestive system. They help us get certain vitamins we can't get otherwise and help us break down our food. So some bacteria are helpful and beneficial. Our last group is a kingdom that was created pretty recently. Used to be people said there were 5 kingdoms. And more recently, they broke off what was called Monera, which included bacteria, into another kingdom as well called Archaea. Archaea, it may sound a lot like bacteria because they're also unicellular, they're also prokaryotes. Some are heterotrophs, some are autotrophs. So it looks like they're identical to bacteria, but in actuality, when scientists explored how they work and the molecules they're composed of, they're not very closely related to bacteria. They're actually kind of their own thing. So they were split off into this kingdom, Archaea. And one of the interesting things about Archaea is scientists have found these organisms in places where they thought nothing would be able to survive. Like in a geyser, in a hot spring that's very hot, has all these sulfur chemicals coming out of the earth. Well, they thought nothing would be able to survive there, but when they actually look, they find some of these Archaea living in those hot springs, living in those geysers. When they look at deep sea vents, where chemicals from inside the earth are being vented deep in the ocean, again, they find Archaea. In the saltiest water on earth, where nothing else can survive, there can be Archaea. So they are sometimes called extremophiles. They can live, some types, in extreme conditions. And so they're fairly interesting for scientists to study.
I've been sprayed by a geyser.
Oh, really?
How bad they're-
Where, out west somewhere?
Yellowstone.
Yeah.
And the Great Salt Lake.
Oh, the Great Salt Lake.
So,
Joe.
All right, when we look at the identified species, you know, in this little pie graph, so animals, it goes all the way from here, all the way up to here. Almost 3/4 of identified species are animals. In fact, more than half are just insects. Insects are the largest group of animals. After that, here we have plants. That's the second sort of most common that's been identified. Mushrooms are over here. Then we have the smaller groups of bacteria,
algae.
and protists.
Are we part of the insects or the other animals?
Wow.
We're not
What do you think?
All right.
See, because there's insects.
So let's do this last table fairly quickly. I think now that we've gone over, this is just kind of a review of the characteristics. So how do they obtain food? Now, raise your hand please if you can tell me what are the 2 words I'm looking for you to use in this row. Shay?
Heterotroph.
Heterotroph?
Yeah.
Or what's the other term we're using in this row? Maggie?
Autotroph.
Autotroph.
I got it.
All right, so animals. Raise your hand, please. How do animals obtain food? Austin?
Heterotroph?
They're heterotrophs. They have to get other things for food. They have to hunt for food. How about a plant, Christian?
Autotroph.
They are autotrophs.
What do we put if I had an
How about fungi? Raise your hand, please. Jared?
Hetero.
They're heterotrophs.
Oh, I thought they were both.
Nope. They all have to eat other things.
Oh, yeah, they had to eat like that type of stuff.
How about protists? Jay?
Aren't they both?
They are both. Some are autotrophs, some are heterotrophs.
Coffee.
How about bacteria and archaea?
Both.
Both and both.
Both of them.
Now, I don't really love the second row because if you know the first row, you probably can fill in the second row because they're related. Although bacteria and archaea is not quite accurate. But do the cells contain chloroplast? Raise your hand. Animal.
No.
Raise your hand. How about some new people here? You're saying like 5 people over and over again. Olivia?
No.
No. Brandon, how about plant cells? Yes. Fungi, Patrick?
No.
No, they're heterotrophs, they do not. Protists, Sarah? Some, we'll say. Some do it, some don't. Now bacteria and archaea, what do you think?
No, because they're already like.
It says some and some, but they really don't have membrane-bound organelles like a chloroplast, but they go through this process of photosynthesis, so it's kind of, you could write some.
But it's not. No, yes, no, same.
All right, number of cells. Raise your hand and tell me the 2 words I'm looking for. Number of cells.
Oh.
Abby?
Multicellular and unicellular.
Multicellular or unicellular? All right, animals. Raise your hand, please. Juliana.
Multicellular.
They're multicellular. Plants. Karima. Multicellular. Fungi. Jared? Some, but others are. So, both.
Okay.
Or multi and uni. How about protists? Christian? Excuse me? Unicellular? Bacteria? Mary Lord? Yep. And Archaea? Karina? Unicellular as well. All right, last up, eukaryote, prokaryote.
Oh,
Raise your hand if you could explain the difference to us.
I know this. I know this one.
Austin?
Eukaryote has a nucleus, but prokaryote doesn't.
Correct. All right, animals, prokaryote or eukaryote? Shay? Eukaryote. Plants. Andrew?
Eukaryote.
Eukaryote. Fungi.
He's a fungi.
Shay?
Aren't they, wait, I don't know. Not both, right? I
Juliana?
don't know.
No, they're eukaryotes. They're eukaryotes. Protist. Eukaryote.
Are they all?
No. Bacteria.
Oh.
Sarah? Pro in Archaea? Pro.
Domain.
Don't put it away just yet. We got one more thing to do here. So these are the kingdoms, 6 of them. But remember, above kingdom is one even larger group called domain. Domain is a group larger than kingdom. All organisms are in one of 3 domains. They're called eukarya, archaea, and bacteria. And you could probably guess which of these kingdoms are in the domain eukarya.
You can't.
Maggie?
Animals.
What else? Just animals?
Plants. Fungi. Protists. No. Yes, they are. Protists and then bacteria and archaea are in the
That's
other
right.
ones.
So we have 3 domains. These are all in the eukarya domain. Then we have a separate domain for bacteria and archaea.